Professor Schippers, may I ask you some questions?
Yes, of course. What do you want to know, Rico?
I wanted to ask you about a paper that you published about the psychological and sociological effects of the corona measures.
Yes, I wrote a paper with that, on that topic with John Ioannidis and Ari Joffe. They both published quite a bit on this. And the idea is that there's so much adverse side effects of the measures, and we call that in the paper non-pharmaceutical interventions. But basically that is, social distancing and all the measures that we had during the corona crisis. What I noticed, one of the first things I noticed is that I couldn't find any proof that the measures worked. I did find a lot of proof that they had very adverse side effects. So for instance, in 2020 I published my first paper on this, For the Greater Good, the devastating side effects of the COVID-19 crisis. I wrote it in May, June, and it was published in September 2020. And the end of 2020, the hunger had doubled in the world. There was a doubling of hunger in the world. 265 million people were on the brink of starvation at the end of 2020.
So that was the first lockdown?
That was actually the first lockdown, yeah.
So if you knew this, then the policymakers globally were aware of this also?
If they were aware, they didn't do anything with it. So actually there is WHO papers that said that these lockdown measures had really bad side effects. One of them was from 2019. So I cite that in my paper. So they do know that there's ethical and concerns for freedom, there's concerns for hunger, there's concerns for rising inequalities. So that's already in 2019 WHO document.
So what we went through with the corona measures was without precedent, so how would you know the effects?
One of the things is that they didn't know, so there was no research, there was hardly any research on this topic. So what they looked at, they had a panel of experts, the WHO, and they let them rate all those non-pharmaceutical interventions. So for instance, social distancing, masking. So they had all kinds of experts rated, and most of the experts, for most interventions, they said, the side effects are probably worse than and we don't know if it will work. So that was already the first sign that they probably wouldn't work.
And now you look back and you did substantiate them.
Exactly, there's meta-analysis even, a huge meta-analysis that looked worldwide if there was any effects of those interventions. And they had a minimum or hardly any positive effects, negligible positive effect, but huge side effects.
Okay, can you summarize then the main side effects or negative side effects of those measures as you've substantiated in your research?
Yes. So I made a whole model on what happened. So for instance, the crisis, and a lot of governments felt that they had to respond, and they also had the idea probably that they had to respond in a very similar way. So what they did is they did a lot of measures, and they took the measures that were in that WHO document, despite the idea that they might not work, and then we saw in real life this playing out. So for instance, there was a lot of mass formation, so people felt really social isolation, meaninglessness, anxiety, frustration, aggressive feelings. These all, we saw that play out in society, but also a lot of the through the lockdowns, a lot of planes didn't fly, so the logistics were halted, and a lot of supply chains were broken. So, for instance, there's 100 million people dependent on the World Food Program, and a lot of them, these people didn't get any food during that period. So we had a massive increase in hunger, like the hunger doubled in 2020. About 150 million people were on the brink of starvation at the end of 2020.
In addition to what we had.
In addition to what you already had. So in total, 265 million people were at the brink of starvation at the end of 2020. And so people also, there was crowd manipulation, crowd control, but these also led to extreme rising inequality. You can see hunger as an extreme inequality, no access to food. But there were also 365 million young people who didn't have access to school meals. They were dependent on school meals. because the school closure. So they didn't get any education, they didn't get any food during the school day. And of course, if they're in a dysfunctional family, they even got like maybe instead of teaching from their father and mother, they were mistreated. So there's also this huge collective trauma that came out of this whole thing. Even if you're relatively well off, then you can still feel this loneliness, isolation. A lot of people lost their jobs. So there's so many effects that's even hard to mention all of them.
So you have substantiated that now. We're recording this mid 2022.
Yeah.
You've published your paper.
Yes.
Have you volunteered that information to the powers that be? What's been their reaction?
Yes, of course. I sent it to the government, and I also asked colleagues. I contacted my colleagues abroad who were working on similar things. So I found a colleague in Germany who was working on the same topic, and he also found no effects of the interventions. So I asked him to write a letter to the government as well, and he said, well, we've been doing this all the time, and nothing came out of it. It's not useful. They don't react, and indeed I didn't get a reaction either. So the next thing I did.
Yeah, what's the next step then?
Yeah, the next step is to try to make it known to the public, because if the government doesn't want to listen, maybe the public wants to listen. And indeed, I went to, I made some films, and these were broadcasted, and the first film was 135,000 people watched that film. And I got so many positive reactions, so a lot of people in the public did see it already quite early on. And I have the feeling that this is coming more and more and more, and that the government is still in a kind of a groupthink process, that they go on this road, and they've chosen this road, and it's really hard to leave it and abandon the idea, because they're now already saying, okay, maybe next fall we have to do the same thing again.
Exactly, that's my worry as well. You mentioned mass formation, which is a form of groupthink, the way
Yes.
I understand it.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
could you explain what is mass formation and how could we break that?
Yeah, mass formation is basically that people form one group because there's a threat, and they form. Matthijs de Smet would probably tell you a little bit different, but they start to form one group, and they also see this one threat that they have to react to. And instead of using the brains of all the people, only a few brains are used, and they're saying, okay, this is the way we have to go, and then everybody or most of the people follow that road. And it might be the wrong road, but they still follow along that path. And it leads to a lot of anxiety, and people also aggressive feelings towards, especially towards people who are in a different situation or think differently. Because they start to see each other as a threat as well. Because if you think you have a deviant way of thinking, or you think, hey, maybe this is not so good, and people think, no, we have to stay together. The social cohesion is so strong in these situations.
Yeah, but that led to adverse effects of those measures.
Yes.
Hunger and psychological issues on a major scale. That's what you describe in your paper. So
Yes.
how do we snap out of that?
Yeah, so can I give you this? So basically how I see it, what happened is that there is this pyramid, and on top of the pyramid people make the decisions, and people here follow suit. Yeah, so how can we snap out of it? It's first of all, people need to be able to think, okay, is this what we want from our world? So I devised an intervention that is thinking about the ideal world if there were no constraints, and thinking about the world if we go on like this. And then people see, okay, wait a minute, maybe if I look 2, 4, 5 years ahead, is this what we want from life? Is this really necessary? And then they may think, okay, and then you can ask people, I ask people, what if this is your ideal world? What would be a first step you can take towards this more ideal world? And then the autonomy is with the people again, and not with some government who says, okay, this is the line we follow, and everybody has to do exact same. It's a one approach. There's one world problem. There's one solution. One world problem is there's corona. One solution is there is a vaccine, and no other world problems exist. And then, because that's a more holistic approach, you say, okay, what is the world that we want, and how do we create it?
So everybody on a global scale has been going through the past 2 years, just like we have. So how can it be that the people in charge aren't changing course?
I think in general, I think most of the global population has gone through this phase, and there's huge side effects, as I described in the papers. But also people can notice. And I think, but there is a lot of incentives that make sure that this situation, the status quo, is being kept. Because for one thing, we found that there's a Random House report of the US government, and I think it's from 2020 or 2021, that in 80 countries the democracy has gone altogether, or has there's much less democracy. And so it's really something that's so in the top there's much more power gained. And I think there was one country that had more democracy, but in general, a lot of countries there was less democracy. And so there's this top of the pyramid where a lot of power and money is accumulated, and there's a lot of incentives to keep the status quo like that. Because if people have accumulated power, and usually the ones in power, I also studied the dark triad for a while. What is the dark triad? That's basically personality, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. So psychopaths, they don't really feel empathy for people, but they have their things that they want, and they want to achieve things. So for instance, if they're on the top of the pyramid and there's no checks and balances, or not a lot, then they accumulate this power and they keep wielding this wheel of power. But there's also the other side. There's the population. We could have asked people, why don't we do anything about it? Why we could have asked the government for coming up with proof that the measures worked. We could have asked everything. But the thing is, if there's a lot of instructions, even in a company, towards people, the dynamic is they come back and ask for more instructions. So how can we deal with this crisis?
And how can we snap out of it, please?
Yeah, okay, so I will tell you later. I will tell you that. But first, the whole dynamic, it's important to understand this dynamic. Because it's a codependent dynamic, basically. So the government tells, okay, this is what we need to do. People ask, okay, can you give us more guidance? So the first thing is to realize that this is not a good dynamic, that this is a dysfunctional thing going on. And how can people realize? Well, that was what I was asking myself at the end of 2020. I told everyone, people didn't really like it, that I told people that there were so many negative side effects, that so many people would die from hunger, that the inequalities were rising, that people were losing their job and their purpose in life. Even
democratic checks and balances were diminishing.
Exactly. And so that was a very important dynamic, because then you get a lot of status differences, and that is also, there is this huge, let's say, downward spiral of, and I even thought that the whole world was getting into a kind of depression, because depression is also less movement. It's going from less. So it was literally going into a depressive state, more or less. And how do you snap out of that? That's starting small. Mm-hmm. So starting with, okay, what do I want as a person? So governments, we know what governments want. We know what they do, and we know their course now. So, but then we should ask ourselves, what is it that we want? So I devised this intervention where I ask people, what would your ideal world look like if there were no constraints? And what will the world look like if we go on like this? And this will set off reflection in people, not in everyone, but in a lot of people. It will. I hope it will set up reflection on, okay, what is it that I want? So taking back the autonomy, and then they can think about what is the first step that I can take towards going to this world, and that can be anything, because I think personally that we should use the brains of all people and not just a few people on the top. And their brains are maybe they're okay or okay-ish, but they have a lot of mixed motivations. There's a lot of incentives and perverse incentives to keep doing what they're doing. One of them being power, but also earning more money if they have like financial
corporate interests.
Yeah, corporate interests and conflicts of interests. Yeah. We've seen a lot of conflicts of interests at the top.
Okay, so how we need to start small, and we need to start with ourselves.
Yes.
Where do we go?
Where do we go? Where do I go? So actually I thought, okay, maybe I want to start a movement together with people that also want to think for themselves. Because the main thing is you have to think for yourself. What is my opinion? We know what other people think and we know what they expect from us. But really making yourself separate from all those expectations, because social cohesion is an evolutionary trait that we have. And people are really they really are inclined to keep on to the social cohesion, and they really, if you look at the basic psychological experiments, you have Ash experiment where you ask people, okay, these are 3 lines, which line is shorter? Then people will give the wrong answer if everybody else gives the wrong answer. And you can see people are uneasy, so they know they are giving the wrong answer. It's not that they don't know anymore.
Regardless, they would do that.
They will do that, yeah.
You're group animals.
Exactly, but they make this decision. You can also make another decision. You can also say, hey, come on guys, you all see a different line, but really I'm seeing this one.
So that's empowerment.
That's empowerment, yeah. And you feel really, I see a lot of people doing that these days, and I think these are strong people. But it's not only strong people, you can also do it when you don't feel strong. It's just, you have to start exercising this. You have to just do it one day. Just start small, let's say with your spouse, and just play it out. And then, because people, you can't change overnight. You cannot change your whole behavior overnight. You have to start small and do it every day. So I know people that say, hey, I know this measure doesn't work. I'm just not being obedient anymore. And then they do it sometimes, and they make the conscious decision to sometimes go along, because, they don't feel strong enough yet to do it all the time. So these are the small steps that everyone can take, and everybody can look in his or her environment what you can do. But first do this, we call that letters to the future. I call it letters to the future. Write your own letter to the future, because that will give you the overview of what you really want to do as a person.
We have talked previously on that in Dutch.
Yeah.
Yes. So where can people find the project, or where can they find sample letters, if you will?
Yeah, it's on the greatcitizensmovement.org or on igigaytv.nl.
Ikigai TV.
Yeah, Ikigai means purpose in life, so I thought it was a really nice name. Because people, did you know that people with a purpose in life, they live on average 7 years longer than people without a purpose in life. And that is what also got me so worried in this particular time, because we are taking away people's purpose. Because if you're only sitting at home waiting not to get sick, and you lose your job, you lose your livelihood. We know that people losing a job already, their mortality rate is higher, they live also shorter, their longevity is shorter. So all these things we know. So people live on average maybe even 10 years shorter if they have all these combination of events.
Okay, so everybody can visit ikigaytv.nl or greatcitizensmovement.org.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.